everyone. Thanks for inviting us to Magnify 2023. We're really excited to be here sharing with you today. Before we get into the main part of the talk, we thought we'd do some quick intros and set ideas about some of the terms that we'll be using.
Hi, I'm Kirsten, she, her, and I'm one of the co-founders of Uncommon, which is the service that we're going to be sharing a bit about with you today. And I'm also autistic.
Hiya, I'm Amy, and I'm the service designer that's been working with Uncommon. I've been working in UX and service design for about 12 years now, and I was also recently diagnosed with ADHD last year. In a moment, we're going to share with you what we will be going through in the talk. But before we do that, I thought it was important to share a couple of things with you. So when we'll be talking about Uncommon today, we're going to be talking about our experience of running the service and our own experiences of being neurodivergent, also working with neurodivergent individuals, and ideas and principles that have come from ND-led research. We don't speak for all neurodivergent people. There's just no way we could, because everybody's completely unique. And some of the terms that we might use today, you might use different terms and you might have different approaches. And if you feel comfortable to do so, we'd love to hear about that in the questions at the end. In Uncommon, we use identity first language. And so that means Kirsten has just said, I'm autistic, and I might say I'm an ADHDer, but you may have different phrases or terms that you want to use. And then the final thing to say is that we are based in England and the UK. And so that's the context of our service, and that's the system we're working within. It might be that your experiences are quite different if you live outside of England. And again, we would love to hear about that. So I'll pass over to Kirsten to share with you what we're going to be talking about today.
So today, first we'll talk about who Uncommon are and what we do. Then we'll be giving a bit of context around our service, so a quick introduction to neurodiversity and why the service is needed. Thirdly, we'll look at our own journey at Uncommon from research through to the impact that we've delivered so far. And then finally, we'll talk about what we've learned in terms of how we can best design amazingly neuro-inclusive spaces for neurodivergent people. So at Uncommon, we provide positive, affirming support for neurodiverse families. Unpacking that a little bit, we are positive, which means that we focus on the idea that we are all different as people and that our perspectives are all unique, but that we all have equally amazing amounts of things to give to the world. With that in mind, we have recruited a neurodivergent-led team of designers, researchers, clinicians, peer supporters, storytellers, and change makers. And a few of our team are here on screen. They're an amazing bunch. And it really has taken all of these skills to kind of create the service that we'll present to you today. So what does Uncommon do? We support neurodivergent teens and their families online at times that suit working parents. And there's a few words in here that are really important to us. So we'll learn a bit in a moment about why we've got to focus on neurodivergent teens. It's a really tricky time for everyone growing into adulthood, but particularly for neurodivergent teens. We also work with their families. Most families have parents who are either working or have various demands on their time. So it's really important to us to create a service that supported those entire families in all their neurodiversities. So we provide 4 key things. We provide psychoeducation for teens and parents. By psychoeducation, what we mean is information, education, support around how our brains work differently and how we can harness both our strengths and manage the challenges that these differences may bring. We also provide parent sessions. So each teen is supported by a parent. So we provide sessions for all those parents so that they can understand how they can best support their teens. And we provide really, really fun peer-to-peer support sessions. You know, everyone enjoys learning about their brains, I think, in the environments that we use, but we also do deliberately fun, non-learning focused peer-to-peer sessions where people can build confidence in making friendships and creating that support network they need to thrive. And then finally, we have our own peer facilitator training. this is a space where it's known that peer support is one of the best ways of supporting this group and their mental health. But there frankly just aren't enough trained clinicians, physicians, peer supporters in the world. So we knew that it was going to be important for us to ensure that we could train the next generation of people to support neurodivergent teams.
We're going to look a little bit at why Uncommon exists, and Kirsten's introed that to us a little bit already. Before we do that, we're going to talk for a very small amount of time about neurodiversity at very high level, so we can explain some of the terms that we use and some of the context that we're designing in. You may have heard quite a few different terms, and sometimes they're used correctly, sometimes they're used incorrectly. We're just going to do a really quick guide to what some of these terms mean. The first term we're going to talk about is neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is the wide range of thinking styles and of ways we receive, perceive, and make sense of information across everybody. And there's a huge amount of variety there, and it's acknowledging that variety. Then for about 80% of everybody in the population will have kind of cognitive thinking profiles, which we class as neurotypical. So that means the way that people perceive, receive, and make sense of information in the way they think generally will fall in a sort of average range. And then current research shows that for about 20% of the population, we are neurodivergent. And that means we diverge from that kind of average way of receiving and making sense of information and thinking styles. And sometimes that means that the way we think can be quite different. At the moment, the percentage is 20%, and we may find that increases as our knowledge and research around being neurodivergent increases as well. When we think about neurodivergent as a term, you may have heard of conditions like autism and ADHD, which we have mentioned, but also dyslexia, dyspraxia, to name just a few. And often what we'll find within the neurodivergent population is that these conditions can coexist. So people will be experiencing more than one of these things. And an example of that is that you're much more likely to be an ADHDer if you are also dyslexic. So another thing that you may have heard before is the term spiky profile. So we were talking about cognitive profiles, so neurotypical and also neurodivergent. And when we're thinking about a spiky profile, what that means is that the things that neurodivergent people might be incredibly capable or motivated about in certain areas, at the same time, there might be other things that are inexplicably hard, even though they could be seen as very similar skills. So an example of this is that someone could have brilliant analytical skills and be super capable at spotting patterns and making sense of information. But at the same time, you might notice that they're forgetting their keys all the time. And that can be confusing both for you as a neurodivergent person, but also for the people that you share your lives with too. And when we look at this from young people's point of view, grown-ups might expect a lot from them because some young people might be incredibly capable at some things and then struggle with situational things like emotional regulation. And sometimes because of that mismatch, people might not be supported in the best way. Another thing that we hear a lot is you don't look autistic or you don't look like an ADHDer. So let's have a little look at why that might happen. Over the years, there's been several different terms that are linked to neurodivergency and different conditions, and you might have heard of them. So one of these might be severe or high functioning or mild. And actually, these labels can sometimes be unhelpful because they exclude some people's experience who might be seen as very capable, and they diminish other people's abilities. If you say the term high functioning, what's the opposite of that? So a better way to look at it could be by thinking about that actually people can often be experiencing very similar things and have very similar needs, but some people might externalize that experience a lot more, so it's a lot more noticeable to others, and other people might be internalizing it, so it's a lot less notable to others, especially those people that maybe don't know that individual as well. When we think about people who might be internalizing, we can become experts at hiding. So that means we might be trying to fit in a lot. We might try to hide certain behaviors or areas of difficulty. We could be overcompensating, and we might be quite perfectionist as well. that can have long-term negative impacts. Not only is it exhausting, but it means that people, unless they know us really well, might not know the extent to what we're struggling. And then we may not be able to access the supports and tools that we really need. And research has shown that you're actually 6 times more likely to experience mental health challenges if you are neurodivergent. Historically, research has been led from people in education, psychology, neuroscience, who happen to not be neurodivergent. And that's meant that neurodivergence has been defined through a neurotypical lens. And that's led to a lot of misinformation, creation of harmful stereotypes, and also interventions and tools which don't really suit neurodivergent people and try and mold them more into a neurotypical way of being. But there's been some amazing shifts in the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen a shift in lots more neurodivergent people connecting, actually leading research in various areas of education, neuroscience and psychology themselves, and redefining what it means to be neurodivergent from lived experience rather than looking from the outside in. What else we've seen is that people are connecting on social media and sharing their experiences. People are unmasking, they're sharing strategies and tools. And that's led to loads of people having those aha moments that I'm not alone, that there's other people experiencing the things that I experience. We've collated a lot of research, and the 3 most important things that we've found that lead to people lead a thriving life who are neurodivergent is friendships and support from trusted adults who understand and support them, chances to engage in skills and interest where people are able to really pursue those interests and hyper-focus and excel in the things that are really interesting to them, and also support tools to help manage emotional regulation and well-being challenges, which are often faced by young people who are neurodivergent.
So in this section, we'll talk a little bit about our journey so far, from very early days of research through to impact. We work with neurodivergent 11 to 16-year-olds with emotionally based school avoidance, but we started somewhere slightly different. Taking you right back to the beginning, so Uncommon is founded by myself, as I mentioned. I'm autistic. I've got a combination of kind of creative and technical backgrounds. And then my co-founder, Sasha, is an ADHD, and she comes from an amazing combination of education and experience design background. So a great kind of combination of creative expertise. And we came together because we hadn't had the support that we needed during our own teenage years. And so what we wanted to be able to do was design a product that would support young people in their journey into adulthood. So we decided that we wanted to develop a product that supported transitions into adulthood. But in order to do this, we needed to choose a place to start. Now, you could kind of see growth growing up as a series of transitions, and this is what the diagram on screen represents. And only 2% of cash focused on neurodivergence research focuses on how we can support neurodivergent people. The other 98% sort of goes on looking at the causes of neurodivergency. And even the money that does go into looking at how to support neurodivergent people often goes into early years. So it looks into early intervention, and there's good reasons for this. But therefore, we knew that that was really well covered. And so the period that interested us was this transition into adolescence, because one of the things that is quite difficult as neurodivergent people is sort of knowing the statistics that surround us. So neurodivergent people die on average 16 years earlier than their counterparts. Even if you graduate from university, you earn half as much as your peers. You're 7 times as likely to end up in hospital going for an emergency psychiatric consultation. And just 40% of autistics even manage to graduate. So there's some really, really tricky kind of life outcomes that you're faced with. And most of these challenges kind of begin in teenage years. So we knew that. We sort of thought that the point that we might start at is looking at that transition from school into university, because we knew that your chances of graduating as an autistic person was 40%, and only 15% of ADHDers have a degree, which is far, far below the national average. So we thought, let's start by looking at that transition from school into further education or work. So why are these transitions so difficult? So we knew that transitions are difficult. We were thinking about university. We know that the majority of people who drop out of university drop out in the first year, and actually most of them have significant challenges in that first term that lead to them then dropping out. But what are these challenges that people face? So as neurodivergent people, we often have lower uncertainty tolerance. Autistic people in general face this quite significantly. I definitely find change difficult. And this is for really concrete reasons. So when we're faced with new situations, our brains work really hard to understand, to an extreme degree, the new structures, systems, spaces, and people that we are in. Now, this can mean that we can also grasp really complex things at school or work really easily. We may be amazingly good at a subject. It might be remembering so many historical facts that you can't believe it, or working out complex math problems. But unfortunately, when we're faced with new spaces, lots of new sensory inputs, new information, new social structures, we can feel really overwhelmed. And our sensory hypersensitivity also means that we're processing a lot of inputs, more than most people. We can feel quite uncomfortable. And also our emotional regulation and our executive function are often developed in different ways from neurotypical people. So with executive function, it often develops more slowly in neurodivergent people. And often we have challenges with emotional regulation, which means that when we are tense or stressed, our thoughts and our feelings are much more extreme, much more up and down than many people. So the second kind of key thing in transitions and why they're difficult is new relationships. And we've touched on this a bit. But as neurodivergent people, we often form relationships differently from neurotypical people. We make friends, but they are friendships that might look a bit different. We often find small talk quite difficult. We don't necessarily see the point of it. Or it might be that, you know, the topics that we need to speak about are really kind of the things that we are super passionate about. So we may be much better at kind of getting into a really in-depth topic with someone than the kind of chit chat that is often needed in new situations when you're trying to just gradually kind of eke into and form those new friendships. So we tend to thrive when we make friends in structured contexts. And of course, in transitions, that those structured contexts will appear over time in new activities and points of interests. But during that transition, often we haven't necessarily fallen into new patterns. It is quite hard. We're not quite sure where we stand. And we can often also find it hard to interpret social situations. So I find it difficult to interpret body language, facial expressions. I often just don't notice a lot of social cues. And for ADHDers as well, they may have just faced a lot of criticism in life. There's statistics around this that sort of means that they may negatively interpret a social situation. They may feel that they're criticized when they're not. They may feel rejected when they're not. But especially in new situations, this can be super tricky because we may just feel as though we're not fitting in, even if it's a kind of natural process of settling in. And this leads into negative cognition patterns. So often we'll have experienced rejection, difference, stigma around either a diagnosis, or even if we don't use that diagnosis publicly, sometimes the way in which we think and act. So my tone of voice can be really flat if I'm not paying attention to it, and people will comment on that when you're a kid. Or if you're an ADHD, you might just have a ton of energy, and again, that's the kind of thing that can kind of get commented on, and we can end up forming possibly quite negative perceptions of ourselves, all which then make it much more challenging in new situations. And all of this kind of results in autistic students being 3 to 10 times more likely to drop out of university. And as we've mentioned, for ADHD, often it means that they often struggle towards the end of high school, don't necessarily make it into university, or don't think that it's the right thing for them. Next slide. But we really need to embrace different ways of thinking and tackling some of the world's most urgent issues. And actually, our very different brains can bring amazing perspectives. Just because you didn't look like the kind of person who would thrive at university doesn't mean you're not going to thrive. Jason Adair, who you can see in the middle of the screen here, was nonverbal at age 11. Jason is autistic. He only began reading at age 18, but now he is the youngest Black professor at Cambridge University, proving that just because you don't follow a typical development pattern or look like other people does not mean that you're in the wrong place or you shouldn't be there. Jason focuses on race and justice in the education system. And we all know Greta Thunberg, a very openly autistic person who's pursued advocacy on climate change. And Summer Farrelly, you can see on the right, is an autism advocate, an animal behaviourist, and an education consultant. And they have been advocating for animal rights and inclusion since the age of 11. So lots of people doing amazing things who really have not sort of appeared like the norm, but have added huge value. We knew that we wanted to enable people who maybe haven't been through the kind of typical paths to feel confident, to understand their brains, to know that they can do these amazing things. We started by learning about what families and users needed during this period. We did live prototyping through a kind of summer school format. We then piloted a very simple product through a series of workshops run with NGO partners, and did further research, this time with about 10 times as many people, to just validate that we were in the right space. And then we ran a more in-depth pilot, so a 2-week wellbeing program with university students. Let's have a little bit of a look at what this sort of learning, doing and refining looks like. Key to what we were doing was co-design. These are our summer school co-designers. We knew that we needed to know exactly what young people needed in their transition into university. So we got this amazing bunch of 12 neurodivergent young people who'd all either transitioned into university in the last couple of years or were about to go into university. And we took them through a series of live workshops, both thinking through their needs and then live prototyping. So we started off by understanding their needs, and we asked them to either look back on their experiences or look forward as to what they were worried about in their forthcoming transition. And we got them to map out week on week what they were worried about, what they'd been worried about, or what they thought they'd be worried about in this transition. And the reason for doing it in such a granular way was to capture all those worries, all those things, all those problems that we might need to support. And this is a kind of a coalescence of all these challenges. So they started out as a series of brain dumps from individuals. So we then brought out key themes, and where you see the flames on the screen, those are things where these are really burning issues. So things are coming up again and again. Next slide. We also, alongside this, did some polls on Reddit and other channels to get a much more kind of mass market take on these needs. So we asked a series of polls across about 10 separate Reddit groups for autistic and ADHD people, asking about the different phases of transitioning into university and different themes. And these are the key themes that came out from those larger polls. And what that meant was that we knew that what had come up for our 12 young people, where we delved into a huge amount of detail, was validated through a group of nearly 1,000 users. So we could be fairly sure that these were really the things that were important. So we then thought about how we can proactively support people during this transition. We wanted to be able to prototype this really quickly. And so what we did was we set up a Discord community where we ran a series of live events. We put in resources for young people. So we did sessions on doing improv for social anxiety. We had psychologists doing like chat show formats with young people about how to manage friendship drama when they arrived at university. And between these live sessions, we also dropped static assets into the Discord platform, and young people could chat to each other, and we had peer supporters on hand. And by doing this, we support 80 young people for a 3-month period for that month before they went to university, through to that settling in period of the first kind of months of moving into halls and starting lectures and all these sorts of things. So really intensive support. And the feedback that we got was amazing. So one person said that just one session was better than 3 years of therapy. And I think this is for a lot of different reasons. So people commented on the fact that it was amazing to hear other people's experiences. They felt really validated by the fact that they knew they weren't alone in struggling with things. They found the one-on-one peer support amazingly powerful. They enjoyed being able to problem solve with other people in those spaces. So amazing feedback. And we had referrals in from professionals. We had requests from families for more support. But the thing that kind of came out again and again was young people saying, look, I just wish I'd had this sooner. Because for a lot of young people, they were really kind of remaking themselves at university, having had a really, really difficult time at school. So we decided it was time to reflect and adapt and pivot, that wonderful word used so much in startups. And so we pivoted and we adjusted our focus to high school, specifically starting with the transition from primary school into secondary school. We knew from the NGO partner that we worked with that for a lot of young people, they would start secondary school, they would really, really try. There'd be that hope of kind of settling in the first term. They'd be pretty burnt out, often have real challenges by Christmas, but they'd be like, we'd have the Christmas break. And then they'd come back after the Christmas break, having had a bit of rest, they'd push and push through, and they'd get to February half term and be in a mental health crisis, with people dropping out, with people facing really significant mental health problems. So we knew that this transition was a really big and difficult one. And these issues are reflected in the stats. You are 50% more likely to struggle with school attendance if you're neurodivergent. And this is because often mental health and social challenges mean that you are simply just finding it too difficult to get into school each day. And 31% of autistic students are persistently absent for this reason. And it's not just people with diagnoses. So young people and families can wait up to 7 years to get a neurodivergent diagnostic screening. And during all that waiting, all that happens is a stacking up of mental health challenges and struggles. So we want to be able to be there for people. We knew that from the feedback from our university students that we were providing the right types of support, the validation, the peer support, helping people unpack their anxiety, the challenges that they faced, helping them understand their brains. That was all kind of in the right space. But we also know that obviously 11 and 12-year-olds are very different from 18-year-olds. So the question was, might we have the right tools, but not the right format? We parked what we'd done, which is always a brave thing to do. And we asked ourselves, what were our big unknowns? We've done a lot of live sessions with students, but students are notoriously different from 11-year-olds. And also the big difference then is that when we're talking about younger age groups, we're talking also about families and parents. So some of our big unknowns were, we didn't know if we could get the trust of families, because effectively we would be working with parents, potentially booking sessions to an organisation they didn't know. We also didn't know what times would suit families. But I think the biggest unknowns for us were, if you're a young person who is not managing to get out of bed in the morning, who is too scared, afraid and worried to go to school, and has maybe had really bad experiences possibly with online schooling through COVID, would they agree to take part in something? Would they want to try the group formats that we were using with students, that we knew that young people found beneficial? And would they also understand and connect with the content? Because what is perhaps obvious and clear and understandable for an 18-year-old is going to be very different for an 11-year-old.
We had these big questions that Kirsten's just mentioned, and we decided to take a similar approach as we had when we were doing the student platform. And we decided just to start refining, learning, putting stuff out there and finding answers to some of these questions. The first thing we did was we started advertising online sessions for young people. And that was to answer our first question of, would people book? Is this something people wanted? And whilst we did that and invited people to take part in these sessions, which were a few weeks away, we spoke with 30 families who were interested in those sessions to understand their questions, their needs and their concerns. At the same time as we were speaking to those families, we were also redesigning all of the amazing tools that we'd created in the student platform, but we were doing it for a younger age group, and we were doing it much more character-based around stories, around narratives. Kirsten and Sasha had experimented with this in earlier sessions in their very early prototyping, and it had gone really well. So we tried to reuse some of those materials and see if that would work well with the age group we were working with. We went on to go on and promote these free courses online on a website, and people could self-book and self-refer. Initially, we were just sort of putting Facebook posts out and seeing if people were interested, and then we moved on to somewhere where people could actually book these sessions themselves. And what we started to learn was, yes, people did want this. Yes, people did book. But there was certain other really interesting things that we learned along the way with that journey. And as we iterated and made the sessions more flexible, made the content more relevant, saw that people were really interested and they continued to book these, we then scaled the service, working with the co-design team that we'd originally worked with to become our peer facilitators, which was just awesome because they'd been involved in the process all the way through. And then they were able to start showing support, giving advice to people slightly younger than them. So where we're at now is that we've grown steadily and we've been testing at each point to make sure that this is what people want. We're not just putting something into the world that people don't want. And now that we know that, yes, this is something that they want, we had a couple of core courses and we've now expanded that. And there's art clubs, there's book clubs, there's so many different things that young people can access at a time most suitable for them. We were really focused at the start with who we were going to work with because we weren't sure if people would engage with it. And so we decided to keep that focus really narrow on where we saw the greatest need. And that was, as Kirsten had mentioned, that crisis point in February for year sevens. And then it almost reached a peaking point in year 9. When we were starting out, because we were doing it quite quickly, for safeguarding, we had parents in the room at the time as we were doing sessions. And what we quickly learned is that it was this amazing thing where it wasn't just for the young people, but actually there was so much value in working with carers and parents too. So how did people arrive to us? Young people, quite a few of them were really burnt out. They'd been in environments and situations that were very negative for their mental health, and I'll go into that in a minute. Quite withdrawn, very wary. When you've had adults treat you in a certain way, there's maybe a lot of mistrust that maybe that will happen again. Also, a lot of young people were highly anxious, low confidence, very isolated. And when we spoke to their families, there was worry, there was tiredness, but there was also this sense of hope and love for the young people they're supporting. So wanting young people to feel less isolated, wanting them to feel self-acceptance, sometimes feeling guilty that they'd removed the pressure. Am I doing the right thing? And often quite limited in choices because they had to maybe reduce work and things like that. So we've known from research that secondary school can be a really hard environment. And when I'm talking about secondary school, I'm talking about mainstream state-funded schools, which the majority actually of young people in the UK will go to. It's only a very small percentage that go to private and independent schools. And within our education system, it's very hard to be flexible. We've taken maybe a bit of an authoritarian approach, and the bias can be towards controlling behaviour rather than looking at individuals' needs. So the types of things that this can lead to is maybe feeling misunderstood by the people that are teaching you, Maybe you'll get told things like you can only hear this once, I'm not going to repeat my instructions. That can be really anxiety inducing if maybe you haven't had a chance to follow. And if you're a rule follower, someone who really, really wants to comply, it's incredibly anxiety inducing to think that maybe you're not because of what you're hearing from the adults around you. There's also a lot of unpredictability, like different supply teachers coming in, just so many unknowns. You're quite often changing classrooms, and there's unpredictability around that. And then there's a lot of sensory overwhelm, so light, sound, smell. And you don't necessarily have the autonomy to control any of those things. So maybe as adults, we can move into a different room, we can ask to work from home, we can try and control our environments a bit better. But when you're at school, you don't have the choice often to do those things. So we wanted to make sure that we were centering young people's experience. We knew that carers and parents were a part of this, but we were also maybe a bit worried about what parents and carers' motivations might be. If parents maybe didn't understand neurodivergence so well, would they be expecting us to push young people back to school? What were their motivations? Or would they want them to feel less alone and understand themselves better? When we're doing the service pilot, we decided that we really wanted to promote 3 things. And this is based on the theory of self-determination. We really wanted to promote autonomy. So we wanted this service to be for young people. We wanted it to be their choice, them to decide, and them to want to do it. We wanted it to be strengths and hope-led. So we would acknowledge challenges, but also increase people's understanding of why they might be having those challenges. And like we've mentioned, we wanted to share tools which would actually help, rather than just saying, oh, this is why. We wanted to give actions that people could take from that understanding. And then the final thing was creating relatedness. So reducing feelings of isolation, the feeling of otherness, and also inspire a feeling of connection as well. Often when we were talking to parents and carers, they'd been through a lot, maybe not being listened to by schools, maybe having a big struggle to try and get their young people's needs supported. And it can be hard when you've had that negative experience to remember the positives and the things that you really love about your family. So we focused with parents and carers about what might be the really amazing things that they observed about their young people. And we heard the same things coming back. So unique sense of humour, considerate, an amazing friend, kind, determined, creative and smart. But often young people weren't getting the chance to demonstrate this because they weren't in the right environments that supported their strengths. I'm going to hand over to Kirsten now to talk a little bit about what the different elements of the service actually were.
As Amy mentioned, we started off with individual sessions. We built up to a course, and then we extended our courses. So we found that families really appreciated being able to sign up to short courses, often be it in therapy, or there are some evidence-based support courses offered in the States, but these courses can be quite long. So courses of therapy are 6 to 12 weeks. The courses available in the States are 14 weeks. And we found that actually families really appreciated being able to engage in a series of short 3-week stints, mainly because their young people were so anxious, so emotionally vulnerable, that often they would find it difficult to get to sessions. They would have emotional ups and downs. And having this kind of flexibility of shorter courses, and then we also enabled people to transfer between different sessions if they just had a bad day at school, or they were having a bad week and they couldn't make it. So that flexibility in the short course format was really, really important, as was sessions being low pressure. So every single session starts with an opening screen that lets young people know that they can keep their cameras off, which was a real kind of deal breaker for most families. And many families specifically said they signed up because they were told upfront that their children didn't need to participate, which is slightly counterintuitive if you're talking about a live interactive service. But this was actually one of the things that enabled a lot of young people to join. At the same time, young people wanted to be able to interact and to find these sessions relatable. But it's really quite hard to talk about yourself as an individual if, for number one, you probably don't want to talk. So another one of our rules is that nobody has to talk. We enabled other ways of interacting. but people want to be able to relate. So what we did was we created a series of characters which had characteristics that are quite typical in neurodivergent people, but these aren't superheroes. So in the younger year groups, superheroes and the superhero analogy is often used for neurodivergence. But what we found when we talked to parents and teens is that teens are quite frankly sort of slightly fed up with the superhero thing. And then also, if you are struggling to speak to someone, if you haven't maybe spoken to anyone at school in the last week or 2 weeks, or even just that day, being told that you have a superpower is really not going to make you feel better when you just worry that nobody wants to be friends with you. So being told that you have superpowers is just, something that young people found really grating when they were finding life really quite hard. So these are our cast of relatable characters. And what we did with these in sessions is we created case studies. We created little scenarios that people could problem solve around. So again, taking it away from the pressure on the individual and kind of talking and thinking about how they can solve problems for themselves and how they can learn about their characteristics, to thinking about characteristics. So what does this look like in session? So as a choice on how to participate, most people would stay off camera, but many people use the chat. We use a series of interactive tools. So polls, anonymous word clouds, open text, and we asked people to respond to a series of very structured questions. These questions were tested quite heavily because neurodivergent people often find it difficult to understand social context, or if a question is asked that is black and white, they will give you a black and white answer to it. They won't sort of answer shades of grey in between. So we did a lot of testing around how we asked questions, how we use simple language, how we made sure that we use direct communication, not indirect communication. And young people loved it. Most people commented that their kid was just so happy being able to interact in a way where they felt safe. They're all anonymous, so people were sharing things that were really very personal about often quite difficult experiences, but whilst feeling safe. And for some young people, this was the first time they'd engaged in anything publicly, anything educational, anything with people for 6 to 12 months. So we were managing to create environments that were safe enough and supportive enough that young people who effectively weren't able to engage in any kind of form of education or with their peers were able to come and engage in these sessions. And then the other kind of bit of secret sauce, as Amy's mentioned, our amazing co-design team members became peer facilitators for us. And what they were able to do is we would talk through a concept about how our brains were different, how this created strengths, but also created challenges. And then we would ask the junior facilitators, the peer facilitators, about their experiences when they were younger. And the benefits of this were that young people were able to see that whilst our peer facilitators had experienced these challenges in the past, they'd also worked out ways of solving these challenges that worked for them, that were unique to them, and that they really felt able to do things that they wanted, that often the young people in our sessions felt were impossible for them, but they could see that these things were possible in the future. What did we learn? We learned that to design neuro-inclusive spaces, we need to think about every single stage of the journey. So starting from before, we learned that we needed to share with people what to expect and to remove uncertainty. So the image on screen is a screenshot of a special page on our website that people were directed to after they booked, with a video of our lead facilitator and with a lovely, really friendly written piece welcoming them and letting them know what to expect in the session. We also knew that we needed to allow time for people to ask questions, and we had a kind of very warm but informative onboarding form that allowed us to understand the needs of individuals. And this helped both parents in understanding that we would make sure that we supported the young person who might be under the care of CAMS, might have experiencing significant difficulties, but reassuring them that we would understand that and support that. And and also then giving our facilitators the information that they needed to support each individual in session. We also knew we needed to remove pressure and expectations, so we were very clear you can attend with cameras off. Even things as small as a lot of young people felt too nervous to even see their names on screen. So some young people attended with the names of their parents on screen, or of a code name that they would just tell us privately so that we knew who was in. We also learned early on that we need to send reminders and provide for flexibility, and I've touched on this a little bit here, but we talk about supporting neurodiverse families, and key to this is diversity. So a lot of the parents of the young people that we're working with were neurodiverse themselves, and like me, have executive functioning problems, which means that we can easily forget things, but also that we need to provide flexibility because, as I said, some young people would just have had a bad day. And the emotional impact, if you are a neurodivergent teen and struggling, of knowing that you're going to miss out on something, and quite often you do miss out on a lot of things. We knew, one of the things that parents said was really important to them was how flexible we were in supporting them, because it meant that they knew that it didn't matter if they missed that session, they could attend another session. So they weren't with us, they weren't going to miss out. So during sessions, we learned we need to be welcoming and flexible. We've talked about that quite a bit, to remove demands. We've talked about allowing people to be anonymous, that it was really important that facilitators shared lived experience. It's been shown through a lot of evidence that peer support is one of the best forms of support for neurodivergent young people, but normally or often that is done one-on-one. And that is fantastic where that's possible, but that is something that is hard to achieve and is not necessarily as scalable as it might be. So we were very pleased to see that working in a group environment and to get great feedback on that in a group environment. We also learned that we need to be flexible to catering to sensory needs. So a lot of our participants would attend with noise cancelling headphones on, which helped them concentrate. We made sure that the space was always very quiet and calm, made sure there was no background noise, but also things like helping people understand how to use closed captions, how to change their view so they couldn't see other people, because sometimes people would find other people's movement or even an avatar on screen distracting. So we learn how to kind of manage all of these things in sessions so that everyone could feel comfortable. Finally, so a lot of people that we worked with have had very difficult experiences with the educational healthcare system, and it was really important for us to ensure that people knew that we were there with them at every step of the way. So we asked for feedback after every single session if people wanted to give it. And we responded and adapted to it and made it clear kind of how we would adapt to comments and feedback. And as we've mentioned, we allowed people to attend other days if they couldn't attend on that day.
So I'm very quickly going to talk about if we saw any change and what that might be. So we had the questions, would people attend? We think we've answered yes, they did. But we also wanted not just did they attend and did they re-attend, but also did we see a change in any of these things around autonomy, competency and relatedness? Here's some of the impact that we had. So 210 young people and their parents have joined short courses, plus 56 joined summer social clubs. And a lot of the people joining the summer social clubs had been people that had joined us originally. So what's really amazing about that is they've chosen to come back and they've enjoyed it. Only 34% of those people that joined with us were attending mainstream school full time, but we actually saw a 77% completion rate. And more than 83 attendees reported improvements in confidence, competence, and connection. And before we wrap up, I'll just read out a couple of comments from parents on that. So around autonomy, what we did see is that maybe for the first session, it wasn't necessarily always young people's choice. They were a bit hesitant. Maybe carers and parents had to coax them along with their favourite food or a promise of something in their special interest. And sometimes they just said, I'm going to leave this open and watch it, and you don't have to take part at all. But what we quickly started to hear back from people is this amazing change of young people being very hesitant, but then actually moving towards the laptop. And we saw changes like for the next session, people going, where's my laptop? I'm ready for my session. So taking ownership. Then for other people, they actually turned the camera on when they'd had it off for 2 sessions, so chose to do that themselves. And then we had feedback about people feeling so proud because they'd been anxious and not thought they'd be able to do it, and then they were. With tools and competency, what we saw was this beautiful relationship building around family knowledge. So young people and adults were having conversations after the sessions about things that they'd learned together that they hadn't realised. So the outcomes of that is one family bought their child a sensory swing to help them when they felt overstimulated. They could go there and just unwind. Another family, they were actually quite clued up about neurodivergence, or thought they were, but they hadn't realized about rejection sensitivity dysphoria that Kirsten mentioned earlier. So that feeling that you're being criticized when maybe to other people you're not. So a parent hadn't realized this, they talked about it after the session, and then that parent adapted the way that they were speaking to their child because they realized that they wanted to make their child's experience easier and better. And they were able to talk about all those things together. Then for relatedness, outwardly, it might not have seen that there was loads of interaction or engagement happening, but those small amounts of interaction and that modeling of experience from the facilitators really made young people feel like they were part of something, like they were connected to people. And we had lots of comments about how people felt like they belonged, like other people were going through the same experience, and that they felt less alone. So we went in with a lot of questions, not sure what we were going to come out the other side with. And we're really, really pleased to learn that this is something that is really useful for the young people that we're working with. And we're continuing that process of learning and expanding and making sure that we are supporting young people with what they really need and want. Thank you so much for inviting us today. We've loved coming and sharing with you, and we'd love to hear your questions and comments in the question section afterwards.